I think what we've learned as Western countries in the last 40 years is that selling and spreading liberal democracy around the world, the way we've been doing it has backfired. Authoritarian countries are cooperating a lot more in an organized way than they used to. I think one of the biggest threats to freedom is our tendency to want to believe that if we can just write it into law, it is. The year before these reforms, they had a 5% increase in new businesses, and the year after, they had a 49% increase.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Tom Clougherty, Executive Director here at the IEA, and I'm joined today by Matt Warner, the President of the Atlas Network. Today we're going to be talking about Matt's work, the state of the global freedom movement, and some hopeful lessons from around the world. Matt, welcome back to the IEA.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here.
We're delighted to have you. Let's start with hopefully an easy, maybe an obvious question. For those who don't know, what is the Atlas Network? What does it do and why is it important?
Well, I'm in very good company here to explain the origin story. We were blessed to be founded by Sir Anthony Fisher in 1981. And my understanding is he formed Atlas Network because he had, after successfully founding IEA, been recruited to advise and help others around the world establish these think tanks, which for many places and people was kind of a new idea. And so he recognized that there would be a real interest and use for some hub support system for the growing global network of independent organizations that were working to advance the ideas of freedom and the free society.
And I mean, my understanding when it started, it was very much about trying to replicate the IEA model, mini IEAs around the world. Atlas today does a lot more than that.
Well, we have learned over time that the structure and the strategy of every organization is going to be context sensitive. And so, inspired again by Sir Anthony Fisher's life as an entrepreneur, we recognize that even think tank leaders need to be entrepreneurial. And for any sort of centralized support system, you need to be very careful about hubris and not thinking that you know the answers. And so our relationship with the 500 plus independent organizations around the world that associate with us is we defer to their vision for change. We think of ourselves as doing a little bit of help for a lot of organizations. And one of the most important things that we do, we think, is just creating more and more opportunities for these organizations to develop relationships with each other, because so much of the innovation and the learning is going to happen among peers. And we don't know the answers, but we've witnessed enough of the answers emerge from smart people getting together and talking about these things that it's a pretty successful model.
And I mean, 500 plus organizations around the world, that's an enormous number. That's probably going to surprise some people listening. Has it grown a lot recently? Are you everywhere around the world now?
No, we're in 106 countries. Okay. And by we're in, I need to always be clear that we have a modest office just outside Washington, D.C., a staff of less than 50. We do not take credit or control all of these amazing organizations. Again, we are creating an opportunity to be connected with people around the world. It has been growing, but we also, because our key goal is to support the capacity building and institutionalization of these organizations. Some are startups, very modest,
right?
2-person teams, for example. And so not all of them stay active or are able to grow. So there's also a churn. So we have a team that is very judicious about maintaining relationships and staying aware of developments around the world. And so we've, probably 10, 15 years ago, we were looking more at 250 or so, and even probably 20 years ago, 100. Now, that doesn't mean that, again, it is not a directory of every organization that does anything related to freedom, because to become a partner of Atlas Network, we have some criteria. And so But yes, it has been growing. It's been very encouraging. And not only have the number been growing, but we've been very pleased to see that the quality of these organizations and the effectiveness and the impact is also growing.
That's great. I mean, maybe another parallel with the IEA that I would draw here is that I think in the early days of the IEA particularly, one of the most important functions we played in Britain was letting kind of individual free marketeers and classical liberals around Britain realize that they weren't alone. A lot of them felt completely isolated. They might have been economists in a Keynesian economics department somewhere, and they might have thought, I'm the only one that still believes in these things and wants to work in this field. And no, the IEA made them realize that there were others and that there was hope and there was, I think, the chance of progress towards those better ideas. I mean, it always seems to me, especially as kind of a libertarian, it's very easy to get depressed in your own country about the state of things. And you see that in Britain, you certainly see it in America. And I think one of the great things Atlas does is by bringing together groups from all over the world. Now, by the way, if we have concerns in Britain and America about the state of our countries, think about some of our, free market think tank colleagues in truly tyrannical countries who are really fighting against the odds and face, much harsher and more difficult conditions than we ever do. But so I think maybe for them, they see like opportunities and shining lights on the hill, hopefully. And then for us, I think it kind of imbues us with a bit of modesty about our own situations, right? Things really aren't that bad. We have a lot to be grateful for. And I think you can get really down, as I said, being a libertarian in any one country, when people like Atlas bring together all of these free marketers and classical liberals from around the world, and you hear their stories, you think, actually, no, this is an inspiring movement and there's a lot to be optimistic about. I mean, is that something that really drives you day to day?
Yes, and what I've observed is that, for example, we do these cohorts of CEOs, which you've been a part of, and grateful for the contributions you've made there, where we want Europeans, Americans, Latin Americans, people from all over the world to spend time together, develop relationships in a context of working on problems. And I think I'll speak for myself and some of my colleagues in the U.S. These experiences are the antidote to, as you say, being too pessimistic and down, but also complacency, because the feeling isn't, oh, things aren't so bad here. Okay, cool, everything's great. It's, wow, how easily any of us could be in the shoes of some of these others who worry about being imprisoned, who worry about being able to feed their families. I mean, it gives you a much deeper and broader understanding of what it means to care about freedom, and hopefully a little bit more nuanced understanding of what is actually a fairly complex topic, which is institutionalizing the ideas of liberal democracy in different contexts around the world. And I've drawn a lot of inspiration and hope as I've gotten to witness not just those collaborations, but also in some of the most difficult places, people have achieved some victories around certain things. And the way I look at it is, I don't think about it as, is this a libertarian utopia yet or not, this country or that? But are there real people whose lives are freer, who have a larger space of choice and freedom to choose, and less government oppression? And if there is a sizable number of people for whom you can say that in some sphere of their life, that's very rewarding to see.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I find valuable is those lessons from other countries, especially from outside the English-speaking world. And it's very tempting just to think, well, the classic liberal democracies, the most free market countries are the English-speaking ones. They're the ones we look at. They're the ones we learn lessons from. I mean, actually, it does seem that in some parts of the Spanish-speaking world, there are enormous strides being made. And there are very prominent free marketeers that, for the most part, we just haven't heard of in the English-speaking world because they're publishing in a different language. And I think, Atlas is extremely valuable in that regard. Let me ask you this question, actually. When I was in Madrid for the Atlas conference last year, another very prominent CEO said he no longer talks about the freedom movement in America. He doesn't feel like there really is a freedom movement in America, that it's kind of been ripped apart by electoral politics and the changes on the right and Trump and all of the angst about that. I mean, I know you work primarily internationally, your focus is not so much on America, but do you feel that in the US?
It certainly has been a very interesting time. I've just airplane read on this trip. I've just finished the latest book from Clougherty, The Dilemma of an Indian Liberal. And I really just like his line, and I'm going to steal it, because he said, talking about elections in India, he said, my big fear is that one of them will win. And I think one of the challenges that we need to pay attention to and learn from this is, broadly speaking, the ideas that we care about are not appreciated and understood. If we look at some of the the policy promises, there aren't a lot from the U.S. election in this campaign, but they're really very small ideas, and they're just handouts of some sort or another, and you just wonder, what is this state we're in now? I'll also say, sitting here in the IEA office, that in that book, Clougherty also says, he draws a lesson from Margaret Thatcher by saying, her point of view was, you did 20% of the work on identifying the solutions and working on them, and 80% selling it. And so he says this is an important lesson, because in other places, and he says the reform period that they had in India, it was very short-lived, but there were some good things that got done. Those working on those problems really did not think that the public would understand or agree or appreciate. And I think as uncomfortable or unfamiliar as some advocates of freedom might be with talking about these in a very marketable way, that is going to be an important part of our job. And I'll say one more thing about that, which gets into a bigger topic, but just to say succinctly, I think what we've learned as Western countries in the last 40 years is that selling and spreading liberal democracy around the world, the way we've been doing it has backfired, because we have made some fatal assumptions in the nature of spreading liberal democracy. And it goes back to kind of a microcosm parallel of how Atlas Network has learned to say, you tell us what the vision for change is in your country, instead of let us send in some Western experts to set up some institutions for you. The nature of institutions, and we can talk more about that with the recent Nobel Prize announcement, but the nature of institutions, as I've been persuaded by learning a little bit about it, is they are both the cause and effect of the people they govern. There's something, there's some complexity to what is going to be the best fit, not the best practice. And we in liberal democracies have to recognize that our institutions are not necessarily the ideal to be copied. They are versions of an ideal that we imagine and that motivates us, and they've worked pretty well. So they should be studied, and they should be looked at, and we should be sharing. But the prerogative for designing change, I think we've learned has to be bottom up, has to be representative of the people that would be governed by it. It's just like anything else. If I'm not going to pay the price for getting an institution wrong, I shouldn't be the one designing it.
Almost Hayekian, what you're saying. Bottom-up, spontaneous order. Yeah. Nate, I think you've written about the outsider's dilemma. Is this effectively what you're talking about?
Yes. And what gives me a little bit of encouragement, I spent a few years right before and then during the pandemic when you were limited in the things that you would normally be doing. Really spending a lot of time with the international development community and developing relationships, friendships, World Bank, USAID, and rhetorically, they do understand this idea that that the way we've been doing it for a long time isn't working. Samantha Power, who's currently head of USAID and was UN ambassador under Obama, she wrote a book called The Education of an Idealist. And while she doesn't put as fine a point on it, and I wouldn't say that she would go around endorsing everything I say, she does make the point that she was humbled about how little we actually know about the societies and cultures of others. And so we should not be so strident about fixing their problems for them. And so the term that they all use now is localization. How can we be more inclusive and participatory with the countries that we hope to see thrive more? Now, I'm not very optimistic that the nature of these multilateral government institutions are really going to be able to make huge strides in that way. They've set big targets to, instead of all of their money going to these large American contractors or other international contractors who come in and do things on behalf of people who have no say in it, they are trying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we often talk about being free market or classical liberal or libertarian. In a way, it's a lazy shorthand. Actually, what our mission at the IEA revolves around is understanding the fundamental institutions of a free society. And in a sense, that is the shared mission. Mm-hmm. It's not so much about pushing a policy agenda. It's about institutions that let people flourish and let people find their own way. And I think it's always important to bear that in mind. We'll do a bit of pessimism and then we'll circle back around to some optimism afterwards. What do you think are the biggest threats to free societies around the world at the moment? You must come into contact with a lot of them through your partner organizations.
Well, perhaps more than ever, in a very stark way, the enemies of liberalism, the illiberal, authoritarian countries are cooperating a lot more in an organized way than they used to. And they don't share an ideology, but they share a strong preference and commitment for, strongman politics. And everywhere the challenge is always the instinctive trade-offs in an individual for security versus freedom. And the false promise from demagogues is that all of this is actually so simple. This chaos you feel in your life, just give me power and I will make sure everything that you despise and are frustrated by, we're just going to use the force of law and the implied violence behind that to just, let's just get this done. And so it's, without meaning to be too pejorative, although there's nothing wrong with being pejorative about authoritarians, it's really childish notion of solving problems. We see this a lot, but, Hayek helped us appreciate the difference between legislation and the law. One is what's written down and one is how things actually work in the real world. And I think one of the biggest threats to freedom is our tendency to want to believe that if we can just write it into law, it is. Right. And so, wanting the complex fabric of life's ups and downs to be solved by a centralized power that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force to just solve all of life's problems and create a utopia or something like it, we keep falling for this.
Matt, do you think that Western countries sort of dropped the ball after the end of the Cold War? Was there a sort of end of history delusion that set in, that everyone sort of just accepted the core tenets of liberal democracy and inevitably would move towards them? I sort of see the same thing just in a British policy context of a degree of laziness or complacency about free market ideas. The sense that, everyone's a free trader now. No one believes in nationalisation or wage and price controls. And so we don't really need to talk about those things anymore. We don't need to continue educating people about those things anymore. And yet they all rear their head again. And it does feel like, although the precise nature of the challenge is different now internationally, this resurgence of authoritarianism, and as you put it, the increasing tendency of them to cooperate with one another. Is that, in a sense, on the victors of the Cold War for not keeping up the fight in some way?
Yeah, I think there are several things there. I mean, one is going back to the point of selling the ideas. People who live in prosperous societies fail to connect their standard of living with liberal reforms for the most part. The dots aren't connected for them. The second is, when it isn't that after the Cold War that the Western countries did nothing. It's that what they didn't work, and in fact, it created. It harmed the brand of liberal democracy, because what liberal democracy is for us to live is different than what we packaged and tried to construct in other places. So what people experienced as liberal democracy was not that, and it didn't work well, and it felt chaotic and dysfunctional, and that naturally led people to say, enough of this. Someone should be in charge. Yeah. And so we harmed the brand, and so we have some work to do to do that. Now, reality is on our side in a sense. That doesn't mean that we can be complacent, but we see, for example, in Argentina, at some point it gets so insane and so unsustainable that people do open their minds a little bit to. We understand how our households need to function in order, and to see a government just not believe that debt matters, not believe that inflation matters, and everyone can be on the payroll. Well, that can't last forever, and it's not even a political ideology. It's just math, and so I think but we can't wait for disasters, but we can help connect the dots on milestone disasters along the way. But we need to get better at understanding that when we talk about liberal democracy, we're not just talking about the efficiency of free markets. We're talking about the ethics of voluntary cooperation and the dignity of self-determination and individual autonomy. And people can relate to that. The idea of human dignity, which I did write a little bit about and studied, is something that the international development community is trying to understand better, because it's a really dominant shared instinct for most humans. In refugee camps, they interviewed people about their experience, and what they all had different answers in different camps, et cetera, on a variety of things. But what they had in common is they said, we want to be respected as humans, and we want the opportunity to take care of ourselves. They had a pride in not being dependent on anyone. And so I think that is a fairly universal value. Of course, we see some of those instincts and morals twisted when we have perverse systems, moral hazard, when, we can see some antisocial behavior in that way. But I think in general, most people, their goal is to take responsibility for their lives and want to make their own choices. Yeah. And we have to recognize that there is no individual human who is endowed with some sort of superior understanding of someone else's life and ought to have the authority to make their choices for them.
Yeah. All right, well, let's pivot to the optimism. You promised us some hopeful lessons from around the world. If you had to pick a few, what would they be?
That's a marketing ploy. It's a bait and switch. No, no. What's giving me hope? Going back to looking at not all changes on paper are big, but they can affect large populations in significant ways. So some of the exciting changes that we've seen from Atlas Network partners, these independent organizations in different parts of the world, for example, in Burundi, which is one of the lowest income countries, and leans authoritarian for sure.
Yeah.
There is a really impressive, small, humble group of intellectual activists who have made the arguments and created an agenda for economic freedom in Burundi. One of the biggest problems that kind of surprises people, how many people in the world actually work in the informal market. And it's like 60% of all workers. And one of the reasons why working in the informal market is limiting is if you're a micro entrepreneur with a little business, you can't grow that business if you can't have inventory larger than a blanket that you can wrap up and run with when if a cop comes to try to shake you down, or if you can't get a bank account because you aren't able to register your business. Well, what they did in Burundi is they looked at all the reasons why lots of these small businesses weren't registering as formal businesses, and some perhaps might have just preferred that way.
Yeah.
But it turns out that the reality was not only did you have to pay a lot in official fees, you had to go to a lot of different offices to get approval, and every single one of them, well, I shouldn't say every single one, but it was very common that there was a lot of bribes that needed to be extracted. Well, if you are a micro entrepreneur in Burundi, you have to make money every day to survive. You can't take 3 months, 2 years to go kind of do these dances, and you certainly don't have the cash for all of the bribes. And so with an authoritarian government, their approach, rather than to agitate and make a fuss, was to go and say, we have some changes that promise to help us increase our national economy, grow this country to a prouder state of prosperity, and these are some simple ways to do it. Well, that won over those in charge, and they lowered the fees and they simplified who could authorize a business. And the year before these reforms, they had a 5% increase in new businesses, and the year after they had a 49% increase. And this is so important for a couple of reasons. One, the actual individuals who, let's remember, let's make sure our mental models are correct. Steve Jobs started in a garage. Let us not look at somebody working in a very modest situation and not imagine that anything's possible.
Yeah.
And for a healthy economy, you do need diversity of firm size. One of the signs of bad institutions is that you have a few mega corporations that are well connected with government, and then you have lots of little micro enterprises that are probably operating outside of the formal economy. You can't go to the courts when somebody scams you, et cetera. And so having more people get access to the formal economy and the formal market and the institutions that support that is going to not just give freedom to lots of people, but the economy will have much more competitive, interesting, diverse, rich, medium-sized, small, large businesses, and increasing in quality and decrease in prices.
Yeah. Well, you may already have answered what was going to be my last question with that response, but I was going to say, and maybe you've got another one up your sleeve, if you had to tell one story to illustrate the importance of the work that the Atlas Network does, what would that one story be?
Well, I'll tell you the story that we learned in that case, although there are similar cases in places like Nepal and in India. In fact, let me tell you a story in India. There was a gentleman who went by Dixit, and he was a street vendor. He grew up in a very rural area, wanted something better, moved to the big city, and sold bracelets. And he did this for 40 years. And he kept a meticulous binder every time the police harassed him because they knew they could get a bribe or take his stuff or whatever. And, most people give up. He never did. He filed a complaint every time this happened, and he had decades worth of these things. And the Center for Civil Society got to know him, got to understand the challenges, and they led the adoption of the Street Vendors Act, which gave legitimacy and some voice and some collaboration opportunities to establish an understanding with government authorities in different places how these street vendors could operate. And the market was asking for these street vendors. They they were doing well. Well, not only did that galvanize Dixit's business, but it gave him a real sense of purpose and calling, because he got elected to be one of the council representatives for street vendors in his community, sitting down with the police who used to harass him as an equal and participatory in government decision making. So now they could establish, where can we operate? When can we operate? Let's create some stability and some peace. And so for somebody watching that story, which you can watch on YouTube, it isn't just seeing a determined, inspiring entrepreneur have a successful life and career, but to see the richness of his civic aptitude. He took great pride, and he said, I sleep with my shoes on in case someone needs me. I get a call in the middle of the night, and one of my street vendors is having a problem. This is the fabric, that Tocqueville talked about, and then Robert Putnam later lamented, I think correctly, although his solutions are wrong. But most of our problems, as I said at the beginning, instead of wanting the childish idea that someone with a gun is going to just solve them for all of us, it's cooperative and collaborative at the local level. We get a lot of things solved when people see themselves as empowered and are afforded the dignity not just to be an entrepreneur but to be part of civic life.
Yeah. And I suppose from seemingly quite small things, quite amazing changes can result. Matt Warner, president of the Atlas Network, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.